Okay, now we're going to move on to Chapter 4, where we deal with individual behavior and differences. One of the key factors in studying organizational behavior is really to be able to understand self. And until you really know your own self and how the behavior is of individuals, it's really hard to move on to groups and organizations. In this particular chapter, we're going to talk about perception and explain its role in understanding and coping with organizational life. Perception makes a big difference from an individual perspective of how they perceive things and make decisions. We're going to look at self-efficacy and how people see themselves as being effective or not, and how that affects their ability to do their job. We're going to again address the increasing diversity of the workplace and how that requires a different approach to managing people in terms of individuality. We're going to also look at what's called in many organizations a psychological contract, where we see an implied perspective from the employee-employer view. And then one of the things that's really a challenge in organizations is trying to change people's attitudes and why that's so difficult. When we look at understanding behavior, we look at abilities and skills, we look at the background of the person, we look at demographics and where they may have come from. We try to assess from a manager point of view of whether we can change any of these particular behavioral aspects that employees come to the organizations with, and how managers can be more effective at least influencing positive behavior that helps the organization be productive. When we look at a behavior framework, there's many different factors that play into that. We have the environment externally and internally. We have the individual themselves and all the things we've talked about, the behaviors that they display in the process of doing their work, and the outcomes of those behaviors. To understand individual differences, managers need to be able to have good observation skills and recognize those differences. They have to look at the variables that might influence individual behavior, and they have to look at some of the relationships among those variables that could play a role in helping to influence more effective outcome. When we do research on individual behavior, we find out what causes it. We find out research on behavior that people tend to be goal-oriented. We want to be able to observe what people do in their behavior. We want to be able to measure it, and we want to know how we can motivate people. When things aren't directly observable, it's a lot more difficult to help people accomplish goals that they've defined for themselves. Questions that managers might want to look at in looking at individuals is, first of all, does that employee, do they have the skills to perform the job? Do they have the resources to perform the job? And is the employee have good cognition and awareness about any kind of problems that they might be encountering or actually creating on their own? If there is a performance problem, when did it happen? What might have been the cause of it? If they're not working well with others, how does that affect performance? And as a manager, what can you do to try and prevent performance problems? When we have poor performance, which is why we often look at individual behaviors, we can see that people that are even highly motivated may not have abilities or skills to perform well. We'll see that also from a leadership perspective, that we have to pay attention to if somebody has been trained or capable of doing their job, whether they're able to accomplish that job. It's not fair to ask somebody to do a job that doesn't have the skills or training. We also look at the ability, and ability isn't always biological, but if we're asking somebody to lift heavy equipment and they're small, or we're asking them to perform in areas where they may not have math or science skills, we have to look at what people can do mentally and physically. And then we have to look at the competencies associated with that and to see if we've matched that. Again, this goes back to recruiting. One of the things I've always said in many of my classes is that if you don't hire, really the biggest deal is how you hire people. Once you have the right people in the job, you can usually do something well. If you have the wrong people in the job, you're going to have lots of problems. And that plays out again of looking at job analysis to make sure that we've hired the right people for the job that we have, to give them a realistic job preview, to make sure that their education and training is effective and appropriate background so that they can do the job. And we don't want to have a lot of guesswork of how we match jobs to people. We really want it to be realistic. We really want people to come in with, again, what we talked about in the last chapter about expectancy or attributions about that job. We want to match people so that in terms of selection, training, employee development, so that people we have a person-environment fit. We want to make sure that the content's appropriate, that behaviors match, and we don't want to hire somebody that's really extroverted in a job that requires them to be very thinking and oriented and quiet and so forth. So we have to pay attention to that person and not just the job description. In terms of defining what skills and abilities that we might want to look at in terms of individual behavior, is how do people have, how flexible people are, what's their ability in terms of reasoning, deductive, inductive, what's their memory, how are they capable of doing math, science, numbers, how in terms of their job do they need spatial and visual orientation, do they need language fluencies, all of those things play out in individual capabilities. If we have jobs that require people to be, like if they're a fireman or a law enforcement, or jobs where they are lifting heavy equipment or moving things, their physical skills, their strength, their body coordination, their stamina, their health. We want to look at demographic classifications for individual, if people, male and female jobs. We're not allowed to discriminate in many of these cases. So we also have to take into factors in terms of job description if it makes a difference in terms of some of those issues about race, gender, culture. There's been research on all different aspects of the workforce. I mean, white males have primarily been the dominant managers. We're seeing a lot of difference in organizations these days. We have a lot more cultural diversity at the workplace in terms of decisions, prescriptions, techniques. We don't want to have faulty generalizations about whether someone's white or not in terms of their assumptions and solutions and how they might be rewarding based on their particular gender or race. A key aspect in individual differences has to do with some of our psychological variables. And those include, what kind of personality does somebody have? How able are they to manage their emotions? What are their true and accurate perceptions of situations? What are they attributing when they're around other people? And what kind of attitudes do they have? Are they positive or not? When we look at perception, we're looking at the different senses. So we have, sight, touch, hearing, taste, smell. One of the things that I often add, which isn't included in some of the perceptions, is also around intuition. So, that plays out a role of people's intuition and how they make decisions. There's a lot of differing perceptions about employees and managers, where in terms of how people perceive their ability to do the job, whether they feel that they're controlled or whether they have freedom, whether something that was requested and done or whether it was or not. And these are the sources of some conflicts at work. Also, how the quality of the product that the organization makes, the perceived quality. Maybe the organization or the manager thinks it's good, and maybe the customer doesn't. And how do we deal with those different kind of perceptions? When we look at differences, there might be some major factors over a manager's perception and a worker's perception. That the manager might think that they've given a lot of freedom to the worker, and the worker might say, I can't make any decisions or do anything without my manager telling me what to do, which affects behavior, and which affects how they feel about whether they're appreciated in the organization or not. One of the things that is very common in terms of looking at individual behavior in organizations is what's called stereotyping. Now, I think everybody stereotypes, but I think you have to take a look at what happens when people engage in stereotyping. It's not necessarily a bad thing to stereotype because it kind of helps structure things, but we can err on the side of overgeneralizing, oversimplifying, putting people in a category that's not fair, that leads to some problems. It could affect promotions or performance evaluations because we stereotype them, race, gender, how they did their job, what team they might root for or something like that. Situational factors can also affect perceptual accuracy in terms of stereotyping. And oftentimes stereotyping is, we have it accelerated or perpetuated by what people need, what their emotions are, the manager's characteristics. It goes back to the same thing about people are looking at who they are and then they're attributing things to the other person, which leads us to attribution, which is the process of looking at perceiving the cause of behavior and outcomes. When we look at attribution, we're looking at a disposition. So we might emphasize, some different aspects of the individual, about they're easygoing or they're not. We might look at the environment saying, wow, it's really stressful, or it's not. We might look at different things in terms of, how consistent that attribution is, how, the consensus that other people might have, and how we can validate it. We do have different kinds of attributional errors that people might make, where people are attributing things just for their own benefit. They might just be so positive they don't see things that are going wrong. That's kind of when people are surrounded by yes people and they don't see that the sky is falling, and just different kinds of errors that we might make. There's also attitudes that we need to look at in individual differences. We might have positive or negative feelings that are either learned through the organization, that we like this or we don't. These kinds of, when we look at components of attitudes, we look at affect, which is kind of feelings. We look at cognition, which is intelligence, and we look at behavior, which is the outcome of their feelings and ideas. In terms of outcomes of attitudes, this is a good graph for you to look at, where you might look at what stimulates people's attitudes. Like maybe they don't like their work design, or maybe they really like it. They find a manager who's very autocratic or democratic. They might like technology that's old or out of date or really new, or they find that they're paid less than somebody that's doing something similar, or they look at their benefits, and that could contribute towards an attitude of emotional anger or intellectual processing, or behavior where they show up late, or they don't do they have poor performance, which shows up in our outcomes of what kind of actions really we usually at that point in an organization are having to deal with the actions of an employee that might be dissatisfied or have an attitude problem. One key phrase that you'll probably hear a lot is a thing called cognitive dissonance. And this is what occurs and causes a lot of anxiety and stress in people when there's a conflict between what decision that they made and what their options are. So they might make a decision that is in complete contrast to what their values are, and then they get into a dissonant state. It might some of the organizational implications are that it might explain the choices that someone might make that might be conflicted about what their attitude is, or that might help predict that people might make changes in something because they have a value in one thing and they're trying to please somebody else. Also, people might say something to try and please somebody else that is in conflict with maybe something that they're already doing. It's difficult to change employee attitudes, but it's really hard when we have an employee with an attitude that is ineffective and causing poor performance among colleagues and also for themselves, and it can affect their ability to stay with the organization. It might also affect being able to change the attitude of that employee, of the message, the situation. There's a lot of factors that we have to figure out in how to deal with attitudes and values. Our values are in direct correlation with our attitudes because our values guide our behavior. And when they become internalized, it guides people's actions. And the effect of the perceptions of that guide the ends of our particular action. So we really, values are not something to dismiss in an organization. We need to know something about that. In terms of job satisfaction, the attitude individuals have about their jobs is important, and it results from the perceptions of their jobs. So if they're satisfied with their job, they might perform better. If they're not satisfied with their job, they might, again, the things that we talked about in the first chapter about absenteeism, turnover, performance. And we have different dimensions linked to job satisfaction. We'll be talking about those later, about pay, job. We'll be talking about that in the motivation chapter, about pay, job, promotion, supervisors, and who we work with. When we look at job satisfaction comparison, there's been discussion about self-employment, that people feel that there's a higher level of job satisfaction. I think some of that might be debatable. In really hard economic times, people like that job, like that freedom, but I wouldn't attribute it to whether they're self-employed or not. But there are factors about stress and job pressure. One of the things about being self-employed is you do have the choices yourself in terms of how you manage your time and your resources. In terms of our customers, we want, in terms of our service-oriented, we want satisfied customers. We want them back. It's a lot harder to develop new customers than to keep the ones we have. good employees, there's research has shown that, matter of fact, in much of the research, they say if you take care of your employees, they're going to take care of the customers. If you treat your employees poorly, they're probably going to treat their customers poorly. So good customer relations begin with taking care of your employees. Personality is another factor of individual differences in organization, and a lot of us know about differences in characteristics, temperaments, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. Personality is based on where people grew up, how their family environment is, their social class. They might have hereditary issues that play out in their personality. When we look at egos, that also plays a role in personality. It'd be nice if we could drop egos in organizations because they lead to a lot of problems, but ego defense mechanisms that we'll see played out in organizations have to do with rationalization, where they rationalize something so that it's to their benefit. They might have strong identification with an issue or a problem and take it on in sort of a cause. They might be have something about compensation, or they really just might not see the reality of the situation because of their own perspective. Theories of personality, we have trait theory, which will come up in leadership, where people are just predisposed towards being a certain way, whether they're dominant, or whether they're happy, or whether they, they say that that's almost sort of hereditary. Psychodynamic personalities, they'll talk about different psychology in terms of subconscious determinants, and then the humanistic, which this book is mostly in our studies of organizational behavior, is the idea that people want to have growth and they want to achieve self-actualization. There's a couple of ways that we measure personality. There's the MMPI, which is talked about in your book, which has something like 250 questions, and then then people get diagnosed with different kinds of personalities. There's also the Myers-Briggs, which is the next slide, where they talk about whether people are extroverted, introverted, thinking, feeling, judging, perceiving, how they go about making decisions in their life. We also have a model on personality that's called the Big Five model, which is discussed in your book, and these are the 5 characteristics around that: how conscientious people are, how extroverted they are, how agreeable they are to work with others, their emotional intelligence, stability, and how much they like adventure and openness to new things. A big factor in individual differences is how the employee or the person believes that they can perform in a situation. How competent do they think they are? That plays out in 3 dimensions. How strong is it? How generalized is it? And what's the magnitude of it? So a person with high self-efficacy is really motivated to accomplish things and to do well. We also have the Machiavellian approach, where it's more political and power manipulation, and we'll be talking more about that in our power chapter. One of the things that we like to try and create in organizations is to instill a culture of creativity. And it should be a core competency in many organizations, because this is how they achieve things. When people are allowed to be creative, they tend to be more innovative. They come up with new processes, systems, products, and so forth. And we develop creativity by looking for ways so that people don't feel that when they take a risk that they're going to get punished. Sometimes we give people a little bit more time out so that they can think things through instead of rushing through their work. We try to build on people's intuition, which I talked about earlier, in terms of that being almost another characteristic. We look at encouraging people to solve problems. Maybe we offer rewards for them. We try and have people interact with other aspects in the organization so that they think what we call out of the box, and they get mentors and helpful. And then this leads us to talking about Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence. And again, that's our ability. This is very important, to accurately perceive, express, and regulate emotions and feelings. It's one thing to have those feelings, it's another thing to regulate them. And lastly, we start talking about the psychological contract that's in organizations. It's often implied. You don't walk in and they hand you a piece of paper with a contract. But we have a contract that, in terms of mutual agreement between how the person's going to be treated and how the organization functions. And people often work off that psychological contract about decency, pay. We expect to be paid once or twice a month. We expect certain things. And when it's violated, a person perceives that the organization hasn't honored one of those obligations, which might be, they say they care about people being able to take care of their children, but they don't offer child care benefits. Or they talk about people being advanced and they don't give them merit pays. Or they talk about job autonomy and they're very restricted in what they're able to do. Or there's no promotional opportunities. All this relates to the psychological contract in the organization.